Thanks to UP Travel for supporting this video. Hey there! So this place used to be loud. Workers called back and forth, whistles screamed the end of the day, furnaces roared, and rivers of molten iron flowed across the floor. Okay, so the iron probably wasn't that loud, but still, very intense. In the late 1800s, this was an iron smelting town, creating more than 230,000 tons of iron ingots, often to be used for making steel. But only 24 years after it all began, this place was shut down. Slowly, it became a ghost town. And now, it's a beautiful state park. Welcome to Fayette, Michigan. Here's what happened here. And if you had lived here, here's a taste of what life might have been like. It's story time. Fayette is located on a little peninsula off the Garden Peninsula, which itself is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. People have lived in and visited this area for thousands of years. For instance, about 2,000 years ago, it was a warm weather campsite for indigenous peoples. But if you ever visit the state park, you'll mostly find the threads of a story that started in the mid-1800s. In 1845, the Jackson Mining Company started an iron mine in what would become Negaunee, Michigan, which is a couple hours drive north of here. At first, they were also smelting their iron in that area. In other words, they were melting it down to remove impurities. But when demand for iron ore went up in the 1860s, they started looking for a better smelting spot. Turns out, from their business's point of view, this little peninsula was perfect, because this area had 4 key things their operation needed. 1, access to iron ore, courtesy of a new railroad nearby. 2, access to fuel, in the form of thousands of acres of forest that could be turned into charcoal. 3, access to flux. This is a material used to help the smelting process. A common type of flux for iron smelting is limestone or dolomite, and there are some incredible dolomite cliffs along the coast here. I will talk about them more in the next video because they've got some surprises of their own. And finally, this area also had a protected harbor on Lake Michigan. This lake connects all the way down to Chicago, and it tends to be warmer and less violent than Lake Superior in the north, up by where Negaunee is. So, ore, fuel, flux, and a harbor. The company's general manager decided that this was the perfect spot for their town, and Fayette was founded in 1867. As for how the town got its name, that general manager was Fayette Brown. Now, Fayette was a company town, which meant the Jackson Iron Company, as they eventually rebranded, they controlled everything to some degree. Like, they owned the company store, and they had a major influence on the local economy and politics. But it wasn't as much of a perfectly planned community as some other company towns in this region. Instead of being built according to a master plan, Fayette grew as it needed to, and it wasn't a particularly fancy place. In fact, if you visit the state park today, I think you'll get the entirely wrong impression. The park is beautiful, clean, well-maintained, and quiet, which is probably not representative of what it was like back in the day. At its peak, about 500 people lived in town, most of whom were immigrants from places including Canada, Norway, and Finland. And overall, they fell into one of 3 social classes, which you can clearly see on site because there are basically 3 neighborhoods. If you were born lucky or worked your way up the chain, or both, you'd be in the upper class, out on the point. This included the company superintendent, the furnace and kiln supervisors, merchants, engineers, and master craftsmen, but also the school teacher and physician. Because never slight the people who teach the next generation or keep the current one alive. These people lived in framed houses, usually one family to a house, and while some of them could see the industrial part of town across the harbor, their neighborhood felt, to me, removed from a lot of the chaos. So I did some reading about Fayette prior to coming here, but now that I'm actually here, I didn't realize how nice this neighborhood was. In the working class neighborhood, it still really felt like I was in town. But on the way here, I walked through some trees, I can hear the birds singing. I can still hear town. You know, a field trip of kids just rolled up, and I can still hear them. But out here, it feels very removed. If you had the skill or had the money, this would be a really nice place to live. That said, I did also forget that the harbor used to be full of boats, so maybe it wasn't quite as peaceful as I thought in the moment. Now, if you couldn't be in the upper class, the middle class was still pretty solid. This tier included carpenters, machinists, watchmen, butchers, and other tradesmen. Their neighborhood was closer to town compared to the upper class, but again, there was at least a little bit of distance. And finally, there was the lower working class, who worked just as hard, if not harder, but who had jobs that tended to require less training. These were the general laborers, the kiln workers, and the wood choppers, and they got paid a daily rate, as opposed to the middle class, who got paid monthly. Daily pay generally meant less financial stability. If you got paid monthly, you might be able to have all of your cash ready for bills and groceries right at the start of the month. But with a daily rate, unless you already had some savings, you probably didn't have that security or flexibility. And according to one census report, most of the residents of this class and neighborhood were recent immigrants to the United States. So people who had probably just spent a good chunk of their savings. In this neighborhood, multiple families shared not framed houses, but cabins. Today, none of the original cabins are still standing on site, but the park did build a replica of one in what they call Laborer's Alley, which honestly sounded like a rugged place to live. What's wild to me about this street and knowing that there were cabins all along here is that on the one side, you've got Lake Michigan with all of the wind and water and weather it can throw at you. And then on the other side, right over there, you've got the furnace complex. So it really seems like you've got two extremes as your neighbors. And I don't really know how there would have been an opportunity for peace around here. Instead of having outhouses, like in the other classes, these cabins had community waste dumps, and slag and charcoal were sometimes piled around the buildings for insulation against wind coming off Lake Michigan. So it was a much simpler way of living. And also, these jobs could be more dangerous. One story that stood out to me was the story of Fred Pig Iron Hanks, who really sounds like he should be a D&D character. It's not clear from what I read if he was a member of the middle or the working class, but either way, he was definitely an example of the kind of toll this labor could take on your body. Pig iron was apparently so strong that he could lift twice as many ingots as the next guy. Unfortunately, he did this so much that he became disabled and ended up running a tavern outside of town, which is admittedly not the worst possible outcome, all things considered, but still. Now, most of the jobs I've talked about up to this point were held by men. The Jackson Iron Company rarely employed women, and even then it was on a task-by-task basis. Like, a woman might be hired for a couple of days to clean at town hall. According to the 1880 census, women mostly managed their homes or worked in someone else's. Other documents show that they ran boarding houses, cleaned offices, were midwives, or worked in brothels on the edge of town. Here, I was particularly struck by the story of Melanie Cabasel. She was a Belgian immigrant who got married when she was 16. When her husband eventually died, she started doing the washing for sailors to provide for herself and her family, and she made only $1.50 every 2 weeks. For comparison, her late husband had made $1.80 per day. And truly, hats off to her and the sacrifices I'm sure she had to make that work. Now, that said, life was not all work in Fayette, at least. There was also a band, a baseball team, and a horse racing track, at least if you could afford a horse. Whenever I'm in historic places or at historic sites like this, I always find myself thinking about how the only thing that separates me from the previous version of this place is time. Like, I could be on a baseball diamond right now or on a horse racing track. I'm just about a century too late. As I was reading about all of this from various sources, I found myself wondering how we know these things about what life in Fayette was like. On the one hand, the 1860s to 80s weren't really that long ago, so I figured we probably have written records. And we do, plus photos. But there have also been archaeological digs here. My favorite story here involves a common archaeological technique that's very useful, but is still funny to me, which is looking at outhouses and waste piles and dried up poop. I mean, think about it. Waste piles and poop can help you figure out things about people's health and hygiene, and can even help answer questions like if different social classes ate different kinds of food, which they did in Fayette. With more money, the upper class could have more expensive fowl and seafood brought in from outside of town. Meanwhile, the working class ate more beef and pork because they were cheaper at that time. So overall, life in Fayette could be very different depending on who you were and what kind of job you held. But really, the main purpose of this place was smelting iron. At the furnace complex, the roar of furnaces, the shouts of workers, and the shriek of whistles filled the air. According to a note from a local newspaper, our 5 o'clock whistle is the most tedious noise ever made. When you smelt ore, you melt it down and remove any impurities, ideally leaving you with just your target metal, in this case, iron. In Fayette, like many sites at this time, this process was powered by charcoal, which they made on-site from local hardwood. Wood was loaded into kilns and then charred for about a week. Next, that charcoal was mixed with crushed iron ore and dolomite from the local quarries. Then this mixture was lifted to the top of the furnace and dropped in. Steam engines blew hot air into the furnaces, and the charcoal caught fire. And to melt iron, these furnaces had to get hot, at least 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, according to a DNR historian I spoke to while researching this. And this is why the charcoal was so important. Untreated wood only burns at around 700 degrees. As the ore melted, the impurities in the iron had a chemical reaction with the dolomite, which was acting as flux. The impurities then separated from the rest of the iron and floated to the top, where they could be skimmed off and removed as slag. Slag, which was often just dumped on the local beach. Finally, the molten iron was released from the furnace, where it flowed along channels dug into the sand floor of the casting building. This kind of iron was called pig iron, because the setup kind of looks like a mother pig and her feeding babies. I guess. People in Fayette spent a lot more time around pigs than I do.
I'm really kind of curious what this place used to sound like when it was active, because right now it just sounds like so many pigeons.
In the end, thanks to the high-quality iron from Negaunee and the charcoal smelting process, Fayette made almost 230,000 tons of what have been called some of the best pig iron ingots being made in the US at that time. What surprised me, though, is that smelting in Fayette didn't actually go on for that long. The only similar facility I've learned about is the Quincy smelter over in Hancock in the western UP, where they smelted copper for more than 70 years. But the Jackson Iron Company closed its Fayette operations in 1891, less than 25 years after this all began. This is partly because industry in the US was starting to favor coal-based fuel called coke instead of charcoal, which takes less labor and less money. But also, Fayette's facilities were starting to need upgrades. So things closed down in 1891. With the main source of work gone, most people moved, but a few did stick around, and over the years, unoccupied houses were sometimes rented to tourists. Ultimately, though, Fayette became what could be considered a ghost town. The state eventually acquired the area in 1959, and they turned it into what is genuinely a very lovely state park. As I worked on this, I kept imagining the goodbyes as people moved away to find work elsewhere. Maybe some moved together, maybe there were going away dinners and friends who wrote letters back and forth, or maybe some people just moved on, because sometimes that's what you have to do. Ultimately, though, as I walked through this place on a June morning, I took a moment to stop and appreciate a luxury that many residents of Fayette probably didn't get to experience all that often. Quiet. The sound of the wind and the waves on Lake Michigan, and not a tedious whistle to be heard. Thanks for being here, and thanks to UP Travel for supporting this video. You can learn more about Fayette State Park and the rest of the Upper Peninsula at uptravel.com, and can follow them on social media for tips for planning a visit. And as always, thanks for being here. I hope you learned something that makes you think about the world just a little differently, and I'll see you soon.